of just stands there sulking, like, go after him! He's getting away! Well, if you wanted to see how that gets resolved, too bad. We're cutting to the next scene. Finally, we get our first look at Obi-Wan as he's working his mundane job harvesting meat out of this giant creature in the sand, and I do actually like this scene. Like I said earlier, a lot of this episode shows us Obi-Wan going about his daily life, and this is exactly what I wanted to see more of in this show. We see him not so discreetly cut a chunk of meat off of one of the blocks and pocket it so that he can feed his EOB later, indicating to us that he's barely getting by as is. Ah yes, substance. I almost forgot what you look like. I also like when their boss unfairly shorts one of his coworkers out of his rightful pay, and you can tell Obi-Wan wants to do something about it, but refrains, and we get to see that look in his eye that signifies just how devoid of hope he's really become. I'm going to be raising issues with the way Obi-Wan's character is handled later, but for now it's fine, so I'll just move right along. I'll even skip past some of these scenes because, like I said, much of it is just Obi-Wan going about his day-to-day, and it's pretty solid. And if you think I'm being unfair by only pointing out the bad stuff, let me be clear. I'm not necessarily saying any of this stuff with Obi-Wan is great, just that it's serviceable given that it's exactly what you'd actually expect out of this show. That's not exactly my standard for excellent writing, though I will point out that watching Obi-Wan buy this toy from a Jawa to give to Luke later is really touching, and I enjoy the added context it provides A New Hope to know that that was gifted to him by Obi-Wan. If anything, it actually informs the type of approach Obi-Wan intends to take with how Luke grows up, trying to make it contrast with Anakin's upbringing. Unlike Anakin, he wants to make sure that Luke is properly fed and sheltered and loved, and given toys to spark his imagination. Again, that's all fine, nothing outstanding as far as writing is concerned, because it's exactly what you'd expect from a series with this premise, but I don't take issue with it, and at this point, I guess that's saying a lot. Unfortunately, after a nice reprieve, we're back to the schluck. As we watch Obi-Wan leave the Lars homestead for the night, he's approached by none other than Nari, who apparently did manage to escape the Inquisitors, though he mentions to Obi-Wan that he had thought he spotted him back in town, but he couldn't be sure. And this tells us that he was still in Mos Eisley when Obi-Wan went there after work to get his EOB, all while the Inquisitors were hunting him. Well, I guess we can't actually assume they were hunting him. For all we know, they were sitting in a cantina playing cards while this was happening. Regardless, I guess he managed to follow Obi-Wan without him noticing. Otherwise, it's extremely convenient that he just happened to find him all the way out here, isn't it? And I'm pretty sure we're going with option 2 here, because this wide shot here as Kenobi leaves town indicates that nobody's following him. And damn, wait until Reva finds out that the very Jedi she's specifically hunting was so close that had she actually done her fucking job and chased after Nari, she might have accidentally happened upon him. That's extremely unlucky. In any case, I've already gone over the specific contrivance that allows this conversation to even happen, so I won't rehash it. But I can't help but find myself pulled right out of the experience because of it, and that's a shame considering it's a scene that, for all intents and purposes, is actually not that bad. Nari wants Obi-Wan to help him against the Empire, but Obi-Wan knows better than to get involved, so he tells Nari to run and hide because the fight is done. Again, we're going to be getting into just how badly they mess up Obi-Wan's character at later points in the story, and when we do, I'm going to be referring back to these scenes in episode 1 where he went mostly unscathed. So just keep that in mind. It is at this point when we're treated to a change in scenery as we find ourselves on the planet Alderaan. And for those of you already having Book of Boba Fett PTSD flashbacks, keep your pants on. This scene will eventually be relevant, unfortunately. We get to follow a young Princess Leia running through the forest, and I don't have much problem with this scene. It's fine. Though before we continue, I will point out that this show takes place a year after Solo, so make of that what you will, I suppose. The next day, Obi-Wan goes into town again after work, which I think was a bit stupid on his part, since he knows there are Inquisitors hunting a Jedi. And he was already recognized by someone once, but alas, here he is. And he's confronted by Owen Lars, who throws the toy he gave Luke back at him. He tells Obi-Wan to stay away from them and that they don't need any of his help. Obi-Wan asks how Luke is doing, to which Owen responds that he doesn't care how he's doing, he just wants to know if Luke is showing any innate Force abilities yet. Obi-Wan persists that when the time comes, Luke must be trained, and Owen spits back, "Like you trained his father." I find it interesting that Obi-Wan says he intends to train Luke, despite the fact that we find out later he spent the last 10 years completely shutting himself off from the Force, but the self-doubt, I don't know, whatever the fuck. We're gonna get into it, just give it time. Another thing this scene brings up that I'm gonna save for later is the next line, where Owen reminds Obi-Wan that Anakin is dead, and it's best if he leaves them alone. Yeah, dead. Again, I'm gonna get into it, but I'm totally fine with Owen believing Anakin's dead. Immediately after this interaction, the Inquisitors are back. I'm not sure where they went or what they've been doing since yesterday, but now they're back, and they're rounding up the citizens to find the missing Jedi. I find it funny that Obi-Wan is able to just hide behind this wall here, and none of the Inquisitors think to check. Like, damn, Owen probably could have just hidden with him, and then we wouldn't have had Reva single him out specifically. Wait, why did she single him out specifically? In this scene, she seems to sense that Owen knows something about a Jedi hiding on this planet, and she threatens to fucking kill him and his family. That's extremely unlucky, and if this ended up being the reason Obi-Wan had to get involved, I'd be calling this a contrivance and a half. It's not, though. Fifth Brother stops her from doing anything rash, which, again, I find really weird, because, once again, she's the only one trying to actually get anything done, and that's apparently a bad thing. But I guess it's lucky for the fate of the entire fucking galaxy that this guy's an idiot. As it stands, this wasn't a contrivance that's fundamental to the plot of the show, but it still is one, because of all the people in this town, Reva just happens to single out the one person who is not only harboring a Jedi, but the very same one that she's specifically looking for, unrelated to her current mission. Man, we've got all sorts of coincidences today, don't we? I also feel it's worth mentioning that Reva is shown to have the ability to extract thoughts from people's minds later on in the show, so I don't see why she didn't do it here to Owen, since she was so confident that this random fucking farmer. It's the thing that the Book of Boba Fett tells us that Jabba.
Trying to find the motive. Why is
Sir, you're reading up.
trying to find the motive?
Also,
Why is
sir, you're reading up.
trying to find the motive?
We're gonna find him. Meanwhile, he's like right around the corner. That's pretty awesome.
Sir, you're still
He's gone. And you're right down. We spent the last 10 years looking for him. I just don't see why we couldn't be getting these scenes on an entirely different planet so that it's less contrived. But then just like Whiplash, we're thrust right back to Alderaan, where we get to see Axel Oregano, played by Jimmy Smits. He's Leia's non-biological father. C-3PO and R2-D2 showed up, and I clapped! In this scene, Leia is talking to one of her cousins, who's being a total dick. He tells her that, according to his father, her parents don't ever let her leave the planet because she's not a real Organa, and they don't want anyone to know about her. Which I find to be a bit perplexing. The reason this confuses me is because I don't know if that's actually what the show wants us to believe, or if it's just meant to be something that some bratty kid said to get under Leia's skin. Because I think if Bail and Breha didn't want people to know about Leia, then they wouldn't display her for all the world to see, right? Like, why is she at this gala and not being hidden away in her room somewhere? I'm bringing up this issue now because it will be relevant in just a bit, but I feel like now is a better time to explore it because it doesn't make any sense. The Organas make it no secret that Leia exists or that she was adopted. Otherwise, how would Reva even know about her? How do you explain this scene where she's waving to the citizens of Alderaan as the crown princess of their world if she's not meant to be known about? And why wouldn't they want anyone to know about her? I doubt the Empire finding out that they adopted a child is going to make them suspicious she's actually Anakin's daughter. Why would that be the conclusion anyone jumps to unless they have a meta-knowledge of the story? And so you might be chalking it up to just something that a stupid kid said, which means it doesn't actually have to be true. He just thinks it for whatever reason. And that's all fine and good, but I have seen people use this as an excuse as to why later on in the episode, Bail tells Obi-Wan that her kidnapping must be kept under wraps. And trust me, we're gonna get to that soon. But I just find this particular excuse to be a pretty lackluster one that doesn't make any sense. If you want me to believe that Leia's existence is not meant to be public information, then don't blatantly show me that it is. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, as a rebuttal, Leia gives her cousin an insightful speech about how he's scared of his father, which is why he repeats things he says without actually knowing what they mean. And overall, his attempts to intimidate people are born of his own insecurities. This promptly shuts him up and causes Bail to smirk proudly at his daughter, and this scene does a great job establishing that even at 10 years old, she's still that precocious, silver-tongued rebel that we all know and love. Hopefully later points in the show don't come in and tell us anything otherwise. That would be embarrassing.
I read that Jedi can make things float.
So then obviously her parents have to give her a stern talking to for being mean to her cousin, and we get a scene that I actually love, where Bale assures Leia that she's his daughter, and that makes her just as much an Organa as any flesh and blood child would be. Some things are stronger than blood and all that, and I really enjoy this scene. It's actually good. I feel this is worth highlighting because, as I was saying earlier, there are some scenes in this episode that I don't hate, but I'm not going to go out of my way to praise them for doing exactly what should be expected given the premise of the series. This is probably the first example of a scene in this show that goes above and beyond and is actually genuinely well written. Of course, stories are more than just a few good moments in isolation, and unfortunately, there's more to talk about here. So Bale leaves her alone after this, and she runs off into the woods again, which is when the actual plot of the show finally kicks off. She gets captured by these goons in a really funny chase scene. These grown adults are trying their very best to make it look plausible that a small child can outrun all of them, and it's just so goofy. There are a few scenes like this in the coming episodes, and I literally can't think of any other explanation than bad directing. Sorry again, Deb. What I especially find so funny about this scene is that you didn't even need the whole chase at all. The ultimate result of this scene is Leia getting a bag thrown over her head, signifying her capture. And that could just as easily have been accomplished by having her run into this guy, take a few steps back, and one of the goons sneaks up behind her and bags her. It's as simple as that. But either way, Leia's been kidnapped, and Bale and Greha decide to call Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan asks them why they don't inform the Senate, and Bale says that this needs to be kept secret, which... why? I already went over how it can't be because the public can't be allowed to know she exists, because that's just clearly not the fucking case. I mean, unless you want me to believe that Bail Organa somehow thinks Leia's existence is a secret, even after she's kidnapped by people who clearly know about her. Alternatively, Bail might not want this information getting out because maybe he thinks the Empire might figure out she's Anakin's daughter? I don't know how you would come to that conclusion, but it's really the only explanation I can think of. If anything, the Empire knowing about Leia's kidnapping would increase your chances of finding her by a significant margin, given that you're an official member of the galactic government that's in league with the Empire. We learn later that her capture was orchestrated by Reva, but she did so in an unofficial capacity without even the support of her boss, which is why she had to resort to hired guns rather than a unit of stormtroopers or just herself. So you can't really use that as a reason why Bail can't expend every resource the Empire has to offer in order to rescue her. If anything, Reva's goals here are oriented around the assumption that the ends justify the means. She thinks that by capturing Leia, she'll be able to lure Kenobi out of hiding to come rescue her, and she figures that once this goal is accomplished, the Grand Inquisitor will have no grounds to punish her because Vader will have seen her actions as necessary. If Bail hadn't gone to Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan hadn't shown up to rescue her, then Reva's entire plan would have fallen apart. Which means that if Bail had just gone to the Senate for help finding her, then once the Empire discovered what Reva had done, something which we see that they do independently of Obi-Wan's actions, then they would order her to give Leia back and then reprimand her to the harshest extent. And of course, you might be arguing that there's no way that Bail would have known any of this, but that's exactly my point. We're looking at this from an objective perspective, having seen all the moving parts ahead of time that the characters are not privy to. As far as the Organas are aware, their child was kidnapped by some unknown faction, presumably to hold her for ransom, and if anything, employing the full might of the Empire, or even just their own personal guard, as Obi-Wan also suggests, is the logical thing to do in response to this. Especially when, as we're going to find out in a bit, you have a way of tracking the exact ship of the people who took her straight to Daiyu.
He's headed for Daiyu. They hid their signature behind a freight transporter. The ship is on its way there now.
If you sent a full brigade of stormtroopers into this meth lab, they would have successfully been able to recover Leia without any real issue, and they would have been able to do so within the confines of the law, which is much more than can be said about Obi-Wan. And then the conflict would be over.
Like, sure, to an objective, omniscient viewer, it would make logical sense for
Fail to employ his army or enlist help from the galactic military.
no conflict and no drama.
Leia would be rescued, the conflict would be over, and Obi-Wan would never leave Tatooine.
And there would be no story.
The same goes for hiring a bounty hunter, which Obi-Wan also suggests. Even if we take seriously that they're concerned about Leia's kidnapping becoming someone to rescue her in a discreet fashion who is also able to operate freely without Imperial scrutiny, unlike Obi-Wan. Some have argued that Bail and Greha don't feel like they can trust a bounty hunter, who are typically seen as lowlives with dubious morals, but that's not intrinsically the case. As we've seen, some bounty hunters are simply honest people trying to make a living with the skills they have, and at this point, desperate times call for desperate measures. Besides, even if we were dealing with someone as ruthless as Cad Bane, you'd be hard-pressed to find any bounty hunter who wouldn't want want to rescue Leia and get her home as safely as possible when dealing with the prospect of a handsome reward, as well as being in good standing with the monarchs of a beautiful planet such as Alderaan. All I'm saying is they could have at least tried. I would be much more accepting of them contacting Obi-Wan for this if, say, they hired a handful of bounty hunters said to be the best of the best, and then had the hunters' severed heads delivered back to them. Not only would this discourage any other bounty hunters from taking the job, but it would prompt Bail to believe that the only one suited to deal with these kidnappers is someone as skilled as the Jedi Knight. All that to say, there are certainly better ways of writing it to where this conflict is believable. Their main justification is that only Obi-Wan knows just how important Leia is, and that even though he has a duty to protect Luke, he has an equal responsibility to his sister, who is just as potentially important to saving the galaxy. And that's fair, but again, just because your own personal guard wouldn't realize that Leia might end up saving the universe, that doesn't mean they wouldn't understand her importance, at least on a surface level. She is, after all, their princess. Any one of them would lay down their lives in order to rescue her. And even if we have to resort to a Jedi, and specifically one who understands why Leia is significant, then why not ask Yoda? At this point in the timeline, he's just kind of chilling on Dagobah doing fuck all.
I've seen your daily routine. You're not busy.
Why not ask him instead of pulling Obi-Wan away from his responsibility to protect Luke? But naturally, Obi-Wan refuses and tells them to find someone else, as Leia will ultimately be better off. The next day, he goes into town where a crowd of people are looking up at Nari's corpse, suspended by these little wire things. Call this a nitpick all you will, but it's pretty obvious to me that they clearly shot this with him being hung by a noose, given that his head isn't slumped over like it would be, and they decided to CG it out in place of all this noise, which is fine, I suppose. Wouldn't want it getting too dark, or we might not be able to play it on Disney+, but it looks really goofy, and it does wonders in revealing the mindset of the people working on this show. You may not know this, but this show was actually meant to be a lot more bleak and depressing than it ended up as. Evidently, they decided a character study about a broken man who's lost everything and has to deal with his past mistakes isn't quite family-friendly enough, so we can't have that. It's such a shame. This moment also hits Obi-Wan right in the feels as he starts to wonder if maybe he could have made a difference had he gone to help. We're meant to be developing how he comes to finally make the decision to go rescue Leia, despite that putting everything in jeopardy, so we had to have this moment. This was the emotional payoff born of the contrivance that allowed Obi-Wan and Nari to have that conversation earlier. He then goes back home and finds Bail waiting for him in his cave. And just, this show is testing me.
Agitated.
So, Obi-Wan told him to fuck off, and Bail's big, bright idea was to go to Tatooine in person to try to convince him to rescue Leia, putting everything in jeopardy and risking exposure. It's a good thing Reva, who knows Bail is friends with Obi-Wan and is in fact relying on him to bring him out of hiding, didn't decide to have him followed. That would have been the smart thing to do right after kidnapping his daughter, and it would have led you straight to the grand prize, cutting out the middleman entirely. But she didn't, so thank God. I guess. I know Bail couldn't have known Reva was using him to find Obi-Wan, but it is still really stupid to pay him a personal visit. He's a famous senator. What if someone recognized him? What if someone somehow followed him and found him visiting a mysterious man hiding out in a cave? Don't you think the Empire might want to know about that? I cannot believe Bail would be this incompetent. I know he's desperate, but as we've already gone over, Obi-Wan is basically the last person to ask for help, so I don't fucking buy that either. Either way, he manages to convince Obi-Wan to help him by basically saying, yeah, I know you fucked up, but shit happens. Now, will you please help me? And just like that, Obi-Wan's on board. As the scene establishes, the real reason he didn't want to go save Leia wasn't due to his responsibility to be there for Luke. I can't leave the boy. This isn't about the boy, and you know it. No. It was because he doubted his own abilities, but Bail says that there is no one he trusts more with his daughter's life than Obi-Wan. I've been waiting to talk about how exactly Obi-Wan is characterized in this show so far until it was more relevant, and as we go and find ourselves with more examples of him acting out of character, I'm going to get into it more, but I want to develop part of it now, because this was the first sign for me that something was wrong. Everything he'd done throughout this episode, not helping his co-worker, refusing to take up arms with a fellow Jedi, initially refusing to save Leia, had all been done because Obi-Wan knows he can't. He has a duty to protect Luke and to eventually train him, and no matter how much he might want to, no matter how unjust a circumstance is, he knows better than to get involved, because to do so is to put everything at risk. I think I said in my other video, there were theories going around before the show even came out saying that Obi-Wan was going to leave Tatooine to save Leia, and it would have nothing at all to do with Luke. And I remember not wanting that to be the case because I really just do not believe Obi-Wan would do anything that risks exposure or death if it doesn't in some way serve to protect Luke. I know Leia is just as important as he is, but again, Bail has other options. Besides, if Obi-Wan dies saving Leia, then there's no one around to train either of them, even if he succeeds in rescuing her. Well, I mean, there is Yoda, but if this show is not going to acknowledge him as an option, then neither am I. And that's all without getting into the fact that he could be captured, and that could potentially lead Vader right to Luke's doorstep, and he simply wouldn't risk that without good enough reason. And I'm sorry, I don't think rescuing Leia is a good enough reason. But for now, I'll put a pin in this, because like I said, the further along we go, the worse it's going to get. So Obi-Wan agrees to go, and he goes out in the middle of the desert to dig his lightsaber out of the sand. I find it really amusing that there are now 2 different times where Anakin's lightsaber was buried underneath the sands of Tatooine, but that's neither here nor there. He then strides into town and gets on a public transport of some kind, brandishing his lightsaber for everyone to see. Why? Why? This is such a small moment in the episode, and yet there's just so much wrong with it. So the lady asks if he's coming or not, and not only is he hanging his lightsaber on his belt, but he, moves his cloak aside right in front of her, as if he just doesn't fucking care who sees it. My dude, my guy, this is the weapon of a Jedi Knight. You might as well wear a neon sign that says Enemy of the Empire, for fuck's sake. There are ways of taking your lightsaber apart and reassembling it when the time comes that you might need it, but you honestly probably wouldn't even need to do that if you weren't getting on a public transport. Don't they check for weapons? Don't they recognize lightsabers as weapons and confiscate them accordingly? They deliberately skip past showing him getting onto this flight because if they had to fucking show it, then he would have been promptly arrested and become a prisoner of the Empire, which would have ruined everything. Maybe he mind-tricked the conductor. I don't fucking know. I mean, the one in the Book of Boba Fett who stopped Din was a droid, which means that wouldn't have worked, but maybe the one working on Tatooine is an actual person. Who fucking cares? I mean, if that's the case, all they'd have to do was show it, and this wouldn't be nearly as big a deal. Still, though, there's a reason that in A New Hope he hired a seedy criminal for a pilot to take him to Alderaan, because he knew Han wasn't going to ask him questions or check for weapons as long as the price was right.
So, boy, you droid, have no questions asked.
I don't see why he couldn't have just done the same here. Hell, why didn't Bail just lend him a ship to use? If Bail was sending him on this mission, I would expect him to provide whatever resources might be necessary to get the job done, which means a reliable ship, some money, and probably even a change of clothes so that he doesn't wander around everywhere dressed as a Jedi, but Bail just doesn't. Wonderful. Meanwhile, Leia's in the bad guy's ship, and she's struggling to get free of her binds. But aha! Lola's here! I established who Lola is, right? I mostly skipped past the earlier Leia scenes, but basically she has this cute little merchandising droid. This little droid, and apparently, when she was taken by the kidnappers, it wasn't confiscated off of her person, which I find interesting and also incredibly stupid. As we see with this scene, Lola's equipped with this little power saw, and it almost cuts her free before the head kidnapper comes in and stops it. He grabs Lola and throws it to the ground, breaking it. I just want you guys to keep track of this droid throughout this video, because this is not the last time we see Lola. I fucking hate Lola. Also, Leia tells the kidnapper guy that her father will send a whole army after them to rescue her. And I think it's funny how we as the audience are meant to view this as a naive and childish thing for her to think, even though she'd be completely right in assuming that Bail would send his most trusted enforcers to rescue her. Silly child. It's right after this that the head kidnapper guy goes and opens a call to his benefactor, and it's none other than Reva. Yeah, I already said that earlier, so this wasn't a big reveal. But now we can finally talk about Reva's plan. So, basically, she wants to capture Obi-Wan and bring him to Vader so that he'll recognize her and promote her to Grand Inquisitor. And apparently, by studying the Jedi archives, she was able to find out that Obi-Wan and Bail were friends back during the days of the Old Republic. Now, that's a pretty weak connection she's making, and she's doing a few leaps in logic because of it, so it's lucky for her that she was right, I guess. So she decides to kidnap Leia so that Bail will ask Obi-Wan to go rescue her, and since we've already gone over why him picking Obi-Wan for the task should have been the last-ditch effort, this is also extremely lucky on her part. And it's lucky that Bail was able to track the signature of the ship the kidnappers were using to get to Daiyu, otherwise he and Obi-Wan would have been sitting around with their thumbs up their asses trying to figure out where Leia was taken. And then Reva's plan falls apart. My point is, she's making a lot of pretty baseless assumptions and has a pretty weak plan, but thanks to a little thing called convenience, we're right where we need to be for the story to happen. You gotta love it. But it's worth mentioning that because this flimsy connection between Obi-Wan and Bail that Reva somehow happened upon turned out to actually strike oil, the Empire should now be fully aware that the Organas are Jedi sympathizers, and it even goes as far as they knew where one of the most infamous Jedi of all time was hiding out and how to contact him. And that pretty much fucks with everything, because now there's no getting back to the status quo of the original trilogy. It's all fucked now. In A New Hope, it's definitely implied that Vader suspected Leia and her family of having at least some involvement with the rebellion.
God, I'm so surprised, John. She brought on an immersive mission this time. Several transmissions were beamed to the ship by rebel spies.
But was never able to move against them because I assumed that Palpatine would demand he find proof before doing so. Remember, at the time, the Imperial Senate was still a thing, and Palpatine did still have to answer to them.
The Chancellor will not be able to control the thousands of star systems without keeping the Senate intact.
Holding her is dangerous. Word if this gets out, it could generate sympathy for the rebellion in the Senate.
So arresting a high-ranking senator for treason against the Empire needs to be justified with irrefutable evidence, which Vader finally managed to get a hold of when he caught Leia red-handed with the Death Star plans. But now you're telling me that they knew Bail had a direct link to Obi-Wan Kenobi for 10 years and said nothing. It's provable under any reasonable doubt, which I would think is grounds for arrest and probably even execution. At minimum, we're looking at him being removed from office and the Senate, and Alderaan would probably have been made an example of as the Empire turned it into a mining world or a labor camp or something like that. There's definitely no way Bail's standing with the Empire remains intact after this. And what's ironic here is that if Bail had allowed it to become public information that Leia was kidnapped, then he would at least have plausible deniability here. He could reasonably plead the case that Obi-Wan must have heard about her kidnapping on the news somewhere and came out of hiding to rescue her. But because he wanted to keep things under wraps, the only way Obi-Wan would have known about it would have been through the Organas. So there's literally no world where they get out of this. It's all fucking broken. Also, and maybe this is a bit out there, but if Vader came to learn that Bail had a direct link to Obi-Wan for all those years, and he knows Bail was a good friend of Padme's, and he knows that Bail and Breha adopted a baby 10 years ago, around the same time that his own child would have been born had Padme survived, then wouldn't he at least suspect that Leia is his daughter? Especially after this scene. I feel like at the very least he would get her DNA tested or something just to make sure. Vader's not an idiot. He absolutely should have put two and two together, but I guess not. And you know what? With everything I've just said in mind, I think after this conflict is over, the best thing for the Organas to do should be to go into hiding. I mean, even if we pretend that their status within the Senate is somehow unscathed, the Empire at least still knows that Leia is a person who, for whatever reason, is of interest to Obi-Wan. Taking her prisoner and threatening her safety is now confirmed to be a guaranteed way to bait Obi-Wan out of hiding, and they know exactly where she lives, so I don't see why they don't just do it again. In any case, that's the end of episode 1, aka the best episode on the show, simply by default. I'm telling you now, it only gets worse from here. Episode 2 starts off with Obi-Wan arriving on Daiyu, and from here he loses the tracking signature of the kidnapper's ship, because apparently all signals in or out are blocked for privacy reasons. Our convenient tracker that allowed Bail to figure out where Leia for reasons that I find to be a bit arbitrary, but now this means that instead of just immediately going where he needs to go, he has to kind of wander around for a bit until he stumbles into the plot. Guys, there are definitely ways to give your main protagonist a challenge to overcome, but I think it's a pretty weak obstacle when you tell me that his magic tracking device is just suddenly no longer an option and you leave him completely directionless for the next few minutes. This is treated like a video game quest. Obi-Wan just has to go around talking with whichever NPC is interactable until one of them gives him information on how to progress the story, and I find it pretty sloppy. And wouldn't you know it, he runs into this NPC character who gives him a special item for no reason at all, and it's something which might come in handy for him later on in the quest. Very neat. Anyway, he's finally approached by some kid on the streets who tells him about a Jedi in the area who can help him find the missing daughter that he's looking for. Obi-Wan follows the kid back to the supposed Jedi, and we're introduced to Haja Estri, a con man masquerading as a Jedi in order to scam helpless people in need of safe passage off-world. Now, here's the thing. I like Haja as a concept. I think it's interesting to see how some people might exploit the myths of the fabled Jedi Knights for their own monetary gain. We caught a small glimpse of that in the Clone Wars when Cad Bane was pretending to be a Jedi to kidnap young, Force-sensitive children for Palpatine. It was explored a little bit in a Mace Windu comic a few years back, but I like what they do with it here. He's a greedy and selfish man, taking money from people who need it more than he does in exchange for a service he could easily give for free out of the kindness of his heart, as any actual Jedi would. My only real criticism here would be that if you're going to run this con, maybe try something other than a Jedi. I mean, you do realize you're currently being ruled by the Empire,